to on the show today is Sharon Salzberg. So Sharon is a bit of a legend in the meditation world. Particularly sort of, it's true, but she's been meditating for longer than I've been alive. Was one of the sort of innovators of the field, people coming from training in Asia and then coming back to the States, one of the co-founders of one of the main meditation centers in the US, in Massachusetts, I believe, author of several books. I was just hearing it interviewed by Dan Harris and Russell Brand, so I've got some footsteps to follow in here. Just reading her new book called Real Change. I'm sure we'll talk about that. And I just really like Sharon's style. I've been the last few days really listening to her interviews and reading her stuff. Just very down to earth, very accessible. And Sharon, I just heard you agreed to be a speaker at the Embodiment Conference. And then I said, let's get her on the podcast. So super pleasure to meet you.
It's very nice to meet you. Thank you so much.
And how did you get interested in meditation? And particularly, I'm interested in your story with the body. That's our kind of thing. So, I'd love to hear a little bit about your Genesis story.
Way back then, before you were born, I went to college at the age of 16. And when I was a sophomore, I took an Asian philosophy course. And that was the turning point of my life, really. Like many people, I'd had a very difficult, traumatic childhood, and like for many people, this was never spoken about, like in my family, and so I didn't know what to do with all of those feelings within me. And speaking of the body, of course, that's where it's all held. And I took this Asian philosophy course, and there were two things about it that were really important for me. One was in terms of talking about the Buddha, when the Buddha said life has suffering in it. This is a part of life. Then I realized that my whole life I'd felt like different and weird and outside of things. And it was this moment, this tremendous moment of feeling like, hey, I belong, this is like, I count too in a way, and then in the course of that course, I heard there was such a thing as meditation. There were practices you could do that were real, that were direct, that were pragmatic, and that if you practice them, if you actually put them into practice, you could be happier. So I was going to college in this city, Buffalo, New York, and I looked around Buffalo and there was nothing I could find. This is 1970. And so I created an independent study project for the university. I said, I'd like to go to India and study meditation. And they said, okay, that sounds good. And off I went.
Wonderful. And it's a hell of a difference now, listening to you and Dan Harris talking about his app, for example. We have the Headspace app, I think, out of the UK that's very popular here. It's a hell of a difference between being able to turn on your phone and turn on an app and having to go all the way to India. I'm curious about that difference.
Well, we talk about that difference a lot because nobody really knows like what it means. In my time, you had to be so highly motivated in order to find an actual practice, not just read about it. It wasn't even that easy to read about it, but you could find some books and stuff, but to actually know there were practices you could do that you could breathe life into, that was tough. And so usually you'd had a lot of suffering in your life, or you were so highly motivated. Like I went off to India. I'd never even been to California before. I'm a New Yorker. I'd never even been to the other end of the U.S. and there were many like me. And so we don't know. Nobody knows what it means, to be casual about things and like pick up an app or be in a health food store looking for something else and see, oh, there's something, maybe I'll get that too. But it's a different time. And so maybe the needs of people are different, and it's just reflecting that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of a middle generation in a way, in that I still had to get on the train to Devon to go to Gaia House, which is a sort of sister school, I think, to some of the. I feel like most of the meditating I've done has been within a very similar school, from what I can gather. And the late great Rob Babea at my first meditation retreat was a Metta retreat.
He was a great teacher.
Very, very great man, underrated, underknown. And that was a metta meditation, which is kind of your thing, right? This is what you're most famous for, the METTA meditation. Maybe you could say what that is, because I feel like you're the sort of the grandmother of metta. That's how you're kind of known.
That's funny. The predominant methodology most people have practiced in this country, that was very much prevalent in India as well, was mindfulness practice or insight meditation. Mindfulness is considered the engine for insight. And metta, or loving kindness practice, was like a little subsidiary, it was like a little something extra you got to do now and then. It's about cultivating a powerful sense of connection and care for yourself, for others, and ultimately for all beings. And so the first time I heard about it was at my first retreat, and it was a little bit like a ceremonial way of saying goodbye. So this is 1971, January of 1971. And I thought, ooh, what's that? And I began to try to understand it. And I never had a teacher to guide me through really the intensive version of the practice till 1985, when I went to Burma for 3 months. And I was so moved by my experiences there that I came back and I'd already been teaching mindfulness, but I came back and started teaching loving kindness. And then I wrote a book. My first book came out 25 years ago, and it was called Loving Kindness. So I've been like a tremendous proponent of that practice ever since I learned it.
Me too. I did a few years of mindfulness, and like most people, that's what you first discover. And I was getting a little bit calmer and a little bit happier, but I wasn't really getting any nicer. And one of my teachers said, why don't you do a bit of metta? Why don't you do a bit of this kindness? And then the idea of was sort of preposterous to me at first, like practice kindness. And then he said, you have to say these phrases, maybe happy, maybe, I'm just going to repeat these phrases. And I ended up at this retreat with Rob sort of by mistake. I think I could do that weekend and not any other one. So I thought, okay, I don't really know what it is, but I'll do it. And I thought, okay, Rob seems fine, so I'll repeat these things. It's a bit silly. And then, I was having very profound experiences within a few days. I was quite shocked. I mean, this idea of practicing kindness might seem a little forced to people, or a little sickly sweet, something like that. I heard there was a book by this woman called Sharon on loving kindness. I'm not reading a book on that, So like, what would you say to those kind of initial reactions people might have?
I think they're very common. I think there's two major controversies I've probably encountered in my years of teaching loving kindness. One is people think it's a stupid thing to do because it leaves you kind of weak and conflict avoidant and saccharine sweet and too gooey. And but really, of course, we see it as a strength. It's a tremendous strength, not a weakness. And the other controversy is the idea that this can be trained. If you take like loving kindness and compassion as sort of sister qualities, a lot of people think compassion is something, it's like a gift. You either have it or you don't. And if you don't, you're out of luck. Whereas in Eastern psychology, they would definitely see it as something that can be trained, because these things are seen as emergent properties of how we pay attention. It's like if you're talking to somebody and you're not really listening and you're thinking about the email you need to write, then there's not that, you're not creating the ground for a sense of connection to grow. Or, these days we can translate it into Zoom or something like that, and you're same thing.
Facebook Metta, if people find it hard to visualize, you don't have to anymore. You can just pull up the agreeable and disagreeable person on Google or Facebook. You don't have to visualize anymore. But, okay. I mean, sometimes I hear people talk about sending metta as if it was some sort of magic energy. Do you sort of see it that way, or do you see it another way?
I don't really see it that way, although I say that because that's a common way of saying it. And every time I say it, I think, whoops, maybe I should, we send metta. But the good thing about saying it that way is that it's meant to be an act of generosity. It's gift giving or offering. Like we start the offering of loving kindness to ourselves. And so phrases we're repeating might be something like, may I be happy? May I be peaceful? And people always say to me, well, who am I asking? And I say, well, you're not asking anybody anything. It's like you're giving someone a gift, in this case, yourself. It's like handing someone a birthday card and saying, may you have a happy birthday. May you have a great year. May you be safe. May you be peaceful. May I be safe. May I be peaceful. And so the positive part of using a word like sending is that it feels like an act of generosity, but it's not really like a package, we're sending overseas or something like that.
Right. I mean, I've heard other people describe it as a sort of positive sort of self-brainwashing, like a kind of, I'm retraining my intentionality here. And I know some people emphasize the phrases, may I be happy, may I be well, may you be happy, may you be well. And Rob really brought to me with it was the body side of it as well. Say a little bit about the body's role in metta, because some people just see it almost like a chanting process.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think any meditation practice is not just like an empty recitation, and it's not a cognitive exercise. So I wouldn't agree with brainwashing, but I'd agree with a bunch of the rest, because the way we pay attention is very powerful. It affects not only how we see things, how we think, but our whole being, because they're intertwined. You can't sort of have one without the other. And so, as we gather all of our attention behind a phrase or a sense of a being, I say being because it may not be a human being, maybe a puppy who, you're offering loving kindness to, or something like that. It's the complete wholehearted attention. It's that gathering of our whole being behind those intentions that does transform our field of intention. And the field of intention is so different than giving ourselves a lecture, Like when you talk about embodiment, I actually don't even think about mind and body. I think about somebody who lives within a space rather than just looks at it from a distance, or from afar. Like I know in this movement toward more and more research on meditation, I know people who've hired people to do the intervention, to do the training, so they could then research the people who were taking the class. And, they've hired people who asked for scripts so that they could just read off the meditation. And that's different, than having it come from such a deep place within that. Or, when I had a book called Real Happiness that came out 10 years ago. And I had it has a lot of guided meditations in it. And I had a big discussion with the publishing house because they told me they were going to hire an actress to do the audio version.
Right.
And I said, well, how are you going to find an actress who has enough meditation experience? It's not like a novel, they have to be saying.
It's got to be Uma Thurman. That's the only option there, isn't it?
Well, it could have been Uma, actually, but they didn't offer me Uma.
I can't think of anyone else. But
I insisted on doing it myself,
Good for you. And it makes it different. I mean, this is the embodied transmission piece, isn't it? And sometimes I think of this like, would I rather be read a book by the Dalai Lama read by Donald Trump, or would I rather be read the back of a cereal packet by Sharon Salzberg? Right. And in terms of which is going to leave me better at the end, it would probably be the cereal packet, with you. Yeah. So I feel like that state transmission is a key piece, isn't it? Okay. So if someone said to you, who should do metta, or, should I do metta instead of my mindfulness of breathing? Like, how does one choose? How does one choose? Like, I have my little practice in the morning, 20 or 30 minutes. I have to split that up. And this morning I was doing some metta because I know I was interviewing you. But it's, do I split that up? 20 minutes mindfulness, 10 minutes metta? Is it just sort of based on personality or mood? Like, how would you decide that?
Well, I mean, it's either up to you or you're working with a teacher who might make some suggestions for you. And when I went to Burma in 1985 and did 3 months of metta loving kindness practice, it became a 4-year period in which I only did loving kindness practice because I was intrigued by it. I was challenged by it. I felt tremendous change in me. And then I went back to mostly doing mindfulness. And at the time, I would say I'm mostly doing mindfulness in my formal sitting every day, but I have a commitment to do loving kindness whenever I'm waiting, and I count every mode of transportation as waiting. So taxis, airplanes, walking down the streets of New York. Well, now I'm not doing any of that, and I've gone back to doing much more formal loving kindness. A lot of people split it up. They sort of are designed for different effects, but they work very well together. Mindfulness is really to help us come much closer to our experience, whatever it is, to see it more clearly, not so many veils of delusion, and to understand, what really makes us happy, what brings us suffering, despite what we've been taught. And loving kindness is really designed to help us be a little bit bold, and move out of maybe ruts of attention, like maybe thinking about yourself and only thinking about the mistakes you've made and the problems you have and where you've gone wrong, and moving into other terrain and seeing what it's like, or very much with other people, like all those many people we look right through, that we discount, that we're indifferent to. They play some role in our life, and we just objectify them. So loving kindness invites us in a way to look at them instead of through them.
Yeah, I had a moment today where I was kind of rushing back home to do this interview, and was a homeless person. I was kind of distinctly aware that I was about to interview someone about loving kindness. And it's, well, can I just at least view this person as a human being, even if I'm saying no? And, I was kind of in a hurry to get, I don't want to be late. So it's like, can I at least take that moment of humanity in there? And I do like with Metta that you can kind of crack out a few phrases on the move.
Yeah.
Like one of my personal favorites is immigration officials. I do a lot of traveling, and Russian immigration are the most challenging. They don't smile. They're pretty harsh looking. And as I'm standing there waiting for my passport to be stamped or whatever, I maybe happy, maybe well. As much as anything, it passes the time, doesn't it? But it's I'm not sure I could do a really good concentration practice at that point. I'm not going to drop into a full body scan, because at any moment they could open the door, but a few phrases is quite kind of practical at that moment.
Yeah, well, it's like interesting there too, when we, kind of almost like categorize somebody, and we just have expectations that they can't move out of that rigid categorization, and as compared to being somewhat open and listening. Because I used to travel a lot too, not right now, and it would be so interesting, year after year, being asked, well, what do you do for a living? And I'd have to say that weird thing, like, I teach meditation. And occasionally now, going into Ireland, going into England, coming back to the US, people would either say, oh, I'm so stressed out, I could use some of that. Or they'd say, oh, which form? I practice too, So
times have changed, huh?
Times have changed.
Yeah, it's not just, oh, maybe the Beatles did that. It's, as you say, same with yoga, like what kind of yoga people say now. Yeah. Okay. And they're not so distinct as well, are they? Like Metta involves concentration, mindfulness involves Metta, right? They're not quite as distinct.
Yeah, no, they're not so distinct. I mean, mindfulness is such a weird word too. And I see now, because to be mindful of something doesn't just mean you notice it's there. Mm-hmm. There's a way of being with it. That's what makes it mindful. That you're not rejecting, you're not blaming yourself, you're not ashamed of what you're feeling, you're also not lost in it and overcome by it. There's a certain kind of relationship that is what mindfulness is, and it has a lot of kindness in it, because otherwise we're just judging ourselves constantly. And so I see people struggling now to try to call it something that will convey that, like warm mindfulness or loving awareness or kindfulness or
because the translation of the Pali was just one potential translation, right? Mindfulness from Sati. But it's like sometimes they say on the train, be mindful not to leave your bag on the train. And I think I should be very loving and open about not leaving my bag on the train, and maybe it's a slight misuse. One thing I've heard you talk about in a few interviews, which is a wonderful concept, Papancha. Am I saying that right? Mm-hmm. You want to say what that is? So I think it's a lovely idea that's maybe underknown in the mindfulness world.
So the word is in the Pali language, which is the language of the original Buddhist texts, Papancha, and it means proliferation. Or as I heard one of the translators of one of my teachers once called it the imperialistic tendency of mind, where something happens and the entire world is taken over. So the example I usually like to use is a story about my friend, my colleague, Joseph Goldstein, where Joseph and I were teaching together somewhere and just sitting in the kitchen having a cup of tea. And someone came in some distress and said to Joseph, I just had this really terrible experience. And he said, well, what happened? And he said, well, I felt all this tension in my jaw and I realized what an incredibly uptight person I am and how I always have been and I always will be. And Joseph said, oh, you mean you felt a lot of tension in your jaw? And he said, yes, and I've never been able to get close to people and it's never going to change. And Joseph said, you mean you felt a lot of tension in your jaw? And it was really interesting for me, like watching them go back and forth and back and forth. And finally, Joseph said something like, why are you adding a miserable self-image to a painful experience? It's like painful enough to feel all that tension in our jaw. But on top of that, now we're going to be alone for the rest of our lives. And so it's this cascade. It becomes overwhelming. We feel so defeated, and things are even harder than they would be. It's not that easy to feel the tension in your jaw, but that's what's actually happening.
Right. So go on.
It's just one of the ways we talk about mindfulness. Sometimes we say, look for the add-ons.
So adding on stories, this is going to last forever. This is about me as, basic Buddhist suffering things like permanence, and this is about me as a self. This is who I am. This, blah 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 blah. Yep, definitely. That this word Papancha has this quality of da. There's a kind of nice quality that it's like my mind does this, and then no. It's like the first bit of suffering was just bad luck. The rest of it was me. You know what I mean?
That's true.
Nice.
I may quote you. That was a great way of saying it.
Feel free. I had it a few times today. I had an email today and I went, hang on a minute. How much of this am I adding to the actual email? The email's bad enough, but I'm adding a whole bunch of stuff. Okay, so I love your emphasis on practicality. And my big obsession has always been getting it off the mat, whether it's the aikido mat or the cushion or the yoga mat. How do we go from this Theravadan, monastic, 3 months of mindfulness, 3 months of this, or even 10 days of Goenka, style, to emails and my sister dealing with her screaming kids yesterday, and the daily stuff of life. Say a little bit about your kind of how to get it off the mat, how to get it off the cushion.
Well, I think that was always the intention. Having co-founded a retreat center, the Insight Meditation Society, I really have a lot of respect for that form. I think that it's like an immersion course, either to learn something or to dip back in so fully. Like you want to learn another language and you go to one of those 2-week programs where everyone's speaking that language and that's it. And I love the reality. I mean, so much has fallen away from people right now. It might be a little bit different, but, ordinarily one of the first things that happens if you go on a retreat because you're silent is that you lose some of that identification. Like, I'm a doctor, I'm a lawyer, I'm nobody, whatever it is, because you're not presenting yourself to others and you're just coming close to your own experience. And so there's tremendous things that can happen there, but nobody lives their whole life in retreat. Even like the monastic picture you're talking about in Theravadan countries, the monasteries are like communities, and they're hotbeds. And
there's one in Britain, and there's Thai people coming with food every day, and
that's right,
coming and talking about their kids getting into university. It's not so peaceful a lot of the time.
No, not at all. There's always something under construction, and it's like, there's a lot going on. So I think that part of it's just difficult. It's difficult because the culture is not necessarily so supportive, like if you were in a Theravadan country and you said to your boss, I feel the need to go do a 2-week retreat, it would be probably considered a pretty positive thing. Whatever your position is here, it's like too weird, and, you might feel very alone. You might be really ethically challenged at work. I've had students who were just weeping, because they were working for some company and asked to tell lies all the time that were consequential for people, like that were hurting people. And, it's one of the reasons that I think community is very important in the West, so that people don't feel so alone and they can have that kind of support to remember that's what it's all about, is how we live anyway.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And in my experience of retreats was I'd get into wonderful states. I'd learn a lot. They'd be certainly like, wow, I didn't even know it's possible to have a mind like this. I'm sort of crying at the flowers after day 4, on the Metta retreat. And then it's like, whoa. And that's profound and wonderful. I'm glad they exist, and I will continue to do retreats my whole life, I imagine. And I thought, I was surprised at how quickly I lost it, in inverted commas, afterwards. There seemed to be quite a sharp drop-off. It seemed to me, as a sort of learning junkie, I'm a learning specialist, that they weren't very good at transfer out of that environment. That seemed to be the weak point to me. So I don't know how we could improve that.
Well, I mean, I think it's a couple of different things. One is, what are we trying to transfer? If it's a state, or especially a state of concentration, it's not going to happen.
It's not going to work out.
And people often say to me, and I use language the same way, but when other people do it, I catch it. Like, people say to me, how do I stay mindful all day long at work? Or how can I keep the level of concentration I got in the middle of the retreat? And I always say, it's not going to happen. Yeah. But, think about that very first sitting where you were practicing letting go of the distraction and coming back to the primary object. Let's say the feeling of the breath. We let go and we begin again, and we let go and we begin again. That's the most important lesson, probably, of the whole thing, because that's what we have to do in life. You get overwhelmed, you get exhausted, you get reactive. Begin again.
And I call this another interview of yours, and I really liked it, because I suspect a lot of people listening to this are like myself. They've done a few retreats, they've done the Grain Girl, they've been a Gaia House or Spirit Rock for a couple of weeks or whatever. And then they have this disappointment. They go, I'm getting attached to it. They can't hold it. And then they can also be this, I won't even call it intermediate stage, but let's say slightly experienced beginner, where it's not so fresh. Like, when I sit now, there's a sense of like, I want to get somewhere because I know I can calm my mind. And there's a sort of cynicism or a goal orientation or we're not, what's your advice for those of us who are sort of not meditation virgins anymore, but aren't really, really practitioners who are very, very solid in their practice? So there's a resistance for a lot of us, not total beginners, that I'm noticing.
Well, that's also an interesting point, to experiment with a different method. I mean, that was when I went to Burma. I've been practicing, very solidly for like 14 or 15 years. And suddenly I was doing a different technique. I didn't know what was supposed to happen. I felt really uncertain about a lot of things. Sayadaw U Pandita was my Metta teacher in Burma. And I remember there was one time we were seeing him, I think, 6 days a week for these meetings to describe our practice and get some feedback. And I said something to him, and my voice was so tentative, like, maybe this is happening. I'm not really. And he said, I believe it's happening to you. Why don't you believe it? Like, I was like thrown back in, to being a beginner. And I began to appreciate that after a while, that there was a fullness and a wholeheartedness that, probably hadn't been there for a while. And so that would be an interesting experiment to make. And just to even realize that is an invitation to begin again in the moment, because it's only the next breath away, it's not like you have to design a remedial course, it's like, here I am, fully here. Oh, look at that.
Yeah, it's sort of like a married love life, isn't it? How do I keep this fresh? And how do I come back to actually, like, romancing my wife, as opposed to sort of, it's my wife again. So it's that's not too disrespectful analogy, but yeah. Where do you see most students are at now then? I mean, obviously there's some very experienced people you've worked with, but then there's this particular condition of COVID, the internet, modern life, less and less teachers like yourself who have done, 3 years somewhere, there was a time when all my teachers had been to Asia for a long time. And now if they've been for a month, that's a big deal,
Yeah, or at all.
meeting mindfulness teachers in Russia who have done a few weekends, you know, and they're sincere and they're nice people, but they've never done a 10-day retreat even, let alone 3 years in Burma. Like, what do you see some of the sort of new challenges we have maybe that aren't quite the same as the time of the Buddha?
Well, I mean, I think, you know, going back to that idea of embodied transmission, I think that's the most, that's like the greatest gift. And I'm sure meeting the Buddha was very different than meeting me, but nonetheless, you know, it is also true that people are teaching who are very sincere and often doing a lot of good, you know, but it's different when you've done a couple of weekend retreats. It just is, I believe. And there's something about that living in the process at the time, even if you're not perfect by any means. Like, one of the funny things about teaching on an app, or recently I was just teaching on Zoom in a conference, and I think I had 6 minutes or something like that. And I said, you know, would you please lead a meditation? So I led a meditation. I led the meditation the way I would. I, you know, give an instruction and then I'm silent. And then a few minutes later, I give another instruction. So apparently all these people freaked out and they were writing in the chat, you know, the live stream's broken. I can't hear anything. Silent. What happened to the audio? Silent. She's silent. And the organizer, to her credit, thought it was the funniest thing she'd ever heard. She wrote, the live stream hasn't stopped. You're supposed to stop. And the same thing in apps. You know, I've been told, well, give the instruction, whatever part of the instruction you're giving, and then say, now do it. And then a few minutes later, give the next instruction and say, now do it. And I said, I'm not doing that because I'm doing it at the time that I'm guiding it. And so I'd rather say in the beginning, when I become silent, that's the cue that you should put into practice what I just said, rather than stopping and starting and stopping and starting. It makes a difference.
Yeah, I've also had students ask for no silence. I've said, but can you guide the meditation all the way through? Like, the silence was somehow too much. You know, some of the younger students is too challenging somehow. So it's like, can you give us a guide? And maybe there's something in that for complete beginners, because, you know, it's a nice anchor for the mind to have a teacher's voice, transmitting state and reminding them. And, you know, something like the conference, it's like people are really spoiled for choice as well, right? Like, you went to one teacher or maybe 2 or 3 teachers, and now we've got, you know, you, Ken Wilber, Shinzen Young, you know, it's just like Judith Blackstone, they're all in the, and it's all there on your computer kind of thing. It can create almost like a bit of a consumer environment, you know?
Yeah. But I think, I mean, Zoom is just like the best uniter. You know, like I just taught today, and people were signing in from Dubai and, you know, all over the world. It was all hours of the day and night, you know, and I thought, isn't that incredible? You know, people are finding some support, you know, in this time.
I feel very grateful for it. And I've been surprised with the conference and other things, how deep people can go in that environment. Mm-hmm. Be like genuine, like to the point where we had to start warning people. We were like, hey guys, I know it's online, but this could actually get quite emotional, or you might find that happening. So it's sort of pleasantly surprised that is possible. Okay, so maybe let's talk a bit about sort of action in the world then. I know, you know, I briefly read your new book because this interview was put together fairly fast. And it seems like the emphasis there is like, hey, what is the relation between inner work and outer work? Mm-hmm. Sometimes Buddhism has this notion of it's about escaping from the world. It's about, you know, being non-attached to things. And then there's the whole engaged Buddhist kind of tradition. So yeah, let's go there for the last part of the interview.
Well, nobody fully escapes, you know, anyway, because you're either living in a monastic community or you're living in society in some way. And even here, you know, in these conditions, like I was reading one of the meditations from the new book out loud, being recorded for this journal, and they chose a meditation on loving kindness for a neutral person. That's somebody we don't like or dislike. And we usually say, try to choose someone you'll run into now and then, because that way you'll notice. Because again, in their formal meditation, maybe nothing much happens, but you will find that as you encounter this person again and again over time, you're interested in them, you care about them, you wish them well, you feel a connection. So for probably 45 years, my colleagues and I have been saying, like the checkout person in the supermarket, like there's the kind of person we're completely indifferent to. And as I was reading that out loud, I thought, whoops, look at that. How do we think we get fed? And, now we call them essential workers here. And we realize, oh, look at that. I am counting on these people showing up or I'm not going to get any food.
Right.
And, how could we be indifferent? And so it's like waking up to our essential connection, which is really, really important. And I think we do that anyway in the course of meditating and getting more insight and getting clearer, but we often don't know what to do with it, like how to express it, how to manifest it in some way. And so that was kind of, in a way, the genesis of the book.
And in terms of the relationship, is it about we meditate to, self-care is a big theme for a lot of people. And then it gives us enough resilience to go and do what we need to do. Because it's tough, it's tough. It's tough sitting with people who are upset. It's tough getting shouted at. It's tough, whatever. Or is it that it actually brings a different quality to that? Like I've worked with protesters and, from Occupy to gay rights to all sorts of things. And a lot of them don't exactly have a very pleasant manner, I've noticed. It's not very, not very compelling for people who aren't already bought into it. Like, what's your sense of the relationship between Buddhist practice, mindfulness practice, and perhaps activism or work in the world?
Well, I think it can go in lots of different directions. A fair amount of what I did in the book was have other people speak. They were interviewed, and so activists would talk about anger and how it was devouring them. You say not a very pleasant manner. Maybe there was a degree of outrage that was really important in the beginning, to kind of step out of one's comfort zone and say, hey, this seems wrong and we should do something about it. But this one woman, this friend Malika Dutt, we met at a conference. We were just put on a panel together and we became friends. And she said on that panel, right off the bat, she told the terrible story of how she became an activist in terms of what she was witnessing, almost accidentally. And then she said, but I don't know how to dial it down. I don't know how to turn it off. And she said, it fills the organizations, people turn on one another. It's like
a lot of infighting in those organizations, a lot of blaming, a lot of infighting.
And I've seen her, in the years since, and she's become a practitioner and, shaman and, like all kinds of things. So, so some of it is that, and some of it is really, I think, broadening our idea of what social action is. I had a conversation with kind of feminist icon, Bell Hooks, and she said she didn't like the term social action. I told her, she's a friend, that I'm used to Buddhist scholars being like maddeningly picayune about words, but she has them all beat, she's like, which is probably why she's a great writer, but she doesn't like the term social action because she thinks it's limited in people's minds to protesting and marching. And she said, what about art? What about creativity? And so I think that was motivating me too, to help maybe broaden our view of what makes change, what makes fundamental change. Like how do we live an ethos of interconnection? And then, interestingly enough, because I wrote the entire book except for the new preface before the pandemic even, and I turned it in and I was like, whoa, a friend was reading it and he said to me, he basically liked the book, but he kept reading the examples thinking, this is what made you anxious? Wait till you see what's coming down the pike, And so that's when I went to the publisher and asked to write a new preface. But look, there's a chapter in there on transforming anger to courage. There's a chapter in transforming grief to resilience. And somebody said to me the other day, are you psychic? And I said, no, I was haunted by the thought that I wrote it too, that I hadn't like written, really up to the minute things in some way.
Mm-hmm. Was there anyone who really impressed you, or just just to take one example, perhaps there's a lot of great sort of speaking throughout the voices in the book, and different kinds of cool people doing interesting things. Maybe the average Buddhist wouldn't necessarily be exposed to. I don't think in many of the Buddhist books I've read, I've ever seen some similar examples. It's always like kind of middle class, mundane. When you're stuck in traffic. And I'm like reading this in Afghanistan going, yeah, this is not my biggest problem right now, So it's, maybe it's one of the examples you want to give from one of the people in the book.
Sure. Not everybody in the book is a Buddhist practitioner or even a meditator, although many are. And the ones who aren't, I thought, were coming from such a strong value system that they were really embodying something that was remarkable and important for all of us. So there's this one woman, Chantal, who's kind of early in the book, who is one of the leaders of the striking fast food worker movement in the States, where these people who work at like McDonald's and places like that.
Pay, right? Barely living wage.
Yeah, they're getting horrible wages. They often don't get their rightful wages. They're cheated in a lot of ways. And some of them work really, really hard. They're living in homeless shelters because they can't afford to live on that salary. So the movement was to get $15 an hour as minimum wage and the right to unionize. And so Chantal is this African-American woman who has worked in those, places for a long time. And she became one of the leaders of the movement. And, in talking to her and other people in the movement, and it was interesting because it was a friend who's an activist who brought us together, sort of yoga teachers and meditation teachers and these activists. And it was very much, saying to the Buddhists, these are incredible people. You should meet them. Not like you can really help these people. And he was right. They are really incredible people. And so many of them would say, my own family didn't want me to say anything. They said, you've got almost nothing. If you threaten, if you rock the boat, you're going to have absolutely nothing. And and they said, but I couldn't keep quiet, and I realized, like talking to Chantal, it was a kind of self-respect. In Buddhist terminology, I would talk about the innate dignity of everybody. And everybody has worth innately. And it was taking a stand on that, and not just for herself, but for others. She says in the book, I kept thinking about the next generation, like these young kids who are coming up, same conditions, same hardships, and no future. And so it shouldn't be that way. We have to think about somebody other than ourselves. And, so she was the kind of person that I just found remarkable.
It's nice to hear it kind of goes both ways as well, because you often hear, this is how mindfulness can help, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, why not make that a mutual learning? How can people be informed by protest movements or by unionism? Or they didn't really have unions in the time of the Buddha, as far as I can tell. And, I'm a fan of that. And I guess one thing I was kind of waiting for in it, and tell me if you think there's a potential critique of some of the identity type politics of modern activism, which seems to be very interested in conceptual categories in a way I think is quite un-Buddhist. Like there's a Buddhist part of me, and I can't quite articulate it, but it's a lot uncomfortable at times with some of the current flavor of activism, which feels you mentioned sort of bell hooks, this sort of language obsession seems to be a part of it as well, actually. As opposed to is there real compassion, or is it just that someone's got the wrong word? They're not up to date on the latest terminology. I'm seeing a lot of people with real compassion who are sort of being strung up because they haven't learned the right etiquette. Yeah. I don't know if you had any take on that.
Well, I mean, there's always both the means and the ends, and then there's also process. So you don't necessarily want to stay at the place in the process where you find yourself in any given moment, but like to think that things are still moving, So I think of two examples of how I defined or how I reconceptualized a goal or a vision. One was a friend of mine, her daughter was born in China, adopted by these white Americans. And when she was a young child, she was maybe 4 or 5 years old, she was in a movie. And the movie had lots of kids in it. It was like about a family reunion and families coming together, and she was one of the kids. And the condition of her mom for letting her be in the movie was that the script never mentioned that she was adopted. She just wanted people to look at this family, you know, 2 white parents, bunch of white kids, and this little Asian girl, and say, that's what a family might look like. You know, and no explanation, no excuse, no apology. Just sometimes families look like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember also there was this television show, Grey's Anatomy, on television in the U.S. And the first time I saw it, and I saw it maybe 3 times, but I saw it, the first time I saw it, it was so striking because it was so multiracial and none of that was ever mentioned. You know, the head of the hospital was like a black neurosurgeon or something, you know, but nobody said like, hey, he's black, you know, it's unusual or anything like that. And so that was sort of like, it's like Martin Luther King Jr.'s beloved community. I thought that's what it should be. You don't have to explain it. This is what families can look like. This is what hospital staff can look like. This is what anything could look like and should look like. Mm-hmm. In fact, does look like, you know, but now because of the sort of almost like the cries of pain that are so prevalent, I'm thinking, well, maybe, you know, Shonda Rhimes in writing Grey's Anatomy should have an episode on what that guy went through on his way to becoming the head of the hospital. Mm-hmm. You know, maybe we have to hear it and say, well, this is not just the beloved community. This is people who got there at a tremendous cost and other people who sailed in or, you know, whatever it is. And so I think that's a lot of what's happening is that a conversation, you know, that maybe needs to happen is happening. I would hate to think that we're not going to get to that place where we just say, this is what a company can look like. This is what a meditation center can look like.
A vision or a dream when it seemed like it was going that way and now something else. Okay, thank you. Anything else on the sort of action in the world front before we wrap up or
yeah, well, I mean, I think, you know, like I was very glad that I wrote the chapters that I did, and, you know, about grief, about anger, about, and in fact, about fear. And there's a chapter I really like about taking in the joy, because sometimes that's hard too. There's so much guilt or exposure to suffering that it just feels wrong to have kind of a time of joy or relief, and yet we need it, you know, because the body can't go on forever, you know, it just can't. And so yeah, it'd be interesting, you know, when the book comes out. We'll see.
Sharon, well, it feels like we're sort of moving to a natural close here. I found a lot of good stuff of yours online, so I'd, you know, recommend people kind of look up a lot of good interviews and good things that are out there, TED Talks and all the rest of it. It was an intense education for me the last 2 or 3 days, which I very much enjoyed while walking around and on the train and doing my business. So I recommend that. In terms of your books, I've heard you have a very good primer, don't you? Sort of introduction to the whole mindfulness field. What's the name?
Yeah, that's Real Happiness.
Real Happiness, and then
the audio version's read by me.
Read by you. A lot of
struggle.
Yeah, I don't like it when I have a book read by someone else. I can get the authenticity piece there as much as anything. And then we talked about your book on Metta, and then your latest book. When is that out? I mean, we're going to put this podcast out fairly soon. So
September 1st.
September 1st. Okay, so it'll be round about the time we publish this if we get straight to it. And that is called Real Change on Flat Iron Books. I'm sure people can find it in all the normal places.
That's right.
Okay, 2 things to finish then. So anything else you want to sort of point people to, awesome resources yourself or else in the other mindfulness sort of community things out there that you just think everyone should know about this? This is great.
I think there is so much. You know, I'm very happy that the Insight Meditation Society, which I co-founded, is doing more online and being closed, you know, and I I think it's just a tremendous thing to be able to either do a sitting or drop into a teaching or take a course or even a retreat online. It's pretty great.
Okay, I want to give a little shout out to Rob Babea, wherever you are, Rob, in the world or somewhere else right now. Like a great loss. I never managed to get him on the show, and he was the one that got me started with the Metta, and you know, he's been a huge influence on a lot of people in the UK in the sort of school, you know, through Gaia House. So shout out to all the Gaia House people. I know a lot of his students are really missing him right now. So this feels like a moment to say that. And Sharon, do you have a closing message about the body? Anything at all you want to say about the body for all our listeners?
Well, embodiment in my mind is like moving from abstraction to reality. You know, it's like, how am I going to live this value? How am I going to make this real? Something like that. And the vehicle is really going to be the mind body in some united way.
Sharon, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a total pleasure. I was sort of professionally happy when I heard you were coming to the conference. I thought, big name, that will attract people. That's great. But also just personally as well. So they were sincerely personally happy when I heard that as well. So thank you, Sharon, for joining us today, and we'll see you at the conference as well.
Thank you so much.